When Battle Frontier made its debut on Cartoon Network, fans were still very split about the cast. Many still weren't too keen on them and either stopped watching the dub and or switched to watching the sub version, or watched the dub just to see the entire Battle Frontier arc all the way through and then dropped it altogether. But others wanted to be fair and give them a chance to come into their own as the characters. So outside of the Mastermind or Mirage Pokemon, how did the cast fare at the beginning? Well, much of the roughness from the special was buffed out, and some of the cast members were more settled into their roles. Of course, Roger Parsons easily slipped back in as the narrator, as well as KZ Rogers stepping back in as Wobbuffet, and Michelle Knotts and James Cathcart were more familiar with their characters. Also, trivia note, when Cathcart did Meowth's voice, he didn't attempt to imitate the way Matty Blaustein had done the voice for years, and instead did his own take on the character's voice, which good on him for doing so. As for James, he intentionally changed the way the voice had been done when Eric Stewart voiced him, as he wanted to give James a softer side and vary up what he can express emotionally. However, when it came to Bill Rogers and Sarah Natochenny, well, yeah, there's no other way around it. They were pretty rocky at the beginning of the season. Now, just to clarify, this is not a slam against the two, as I'm certain they were doing their best with how they were directed at the time, but their performances early on were very rough and lackluster, and occasionally came off like they were trying too hard to replicate the original voices. For example, Sarah's ass voice sounded a lot more throaty and gravelly than raspy.
Pikachu, use thunder! I'm so ready! Leaf Blade, let's go!
Of course, at this point in the show's run, they were new to voicing these characters and hadn't quite come into their own yet, and in Sarah Natochenny's case, getting used to the process of dubbing an anime, though she caught on to it pretty quickly. So naturally, they were going to sound rough at first. Fortunately though, as the season went on, the two did get better at voicing the characters. Also, it wasn't that the two didn't know how to act beforehand. Quite the opposite. Sarah Natochenny had briefly studied acting before she was cast. But at the time, she hadn't done any voice acting before, much less worked on an English dub for an anime. And in fact, Ash was her very first voice acting role. So you can imagine it was tricky for her to get into it at first, especially since she was taking over from Veronica Taylor. That, and she was only 18 years old when she started. As for Bill Rogers, he had acting experience in television, on stage, and had done voice work in other anime before he was cast as Brock, most notably in the very first anime he ever did, Assemble Insert, where he voiced the Prime Minister. But as I already said, they got better at performing the voices over the course of production. Now, what's not often discussed about the changeover is that the cast wasn't the only thing that changed during production. Although Taj Productions returned to produce the dub, not all of the crew members from the original tenure with 4Kids came back, and some that did ended up being shuffled to different positions. Now, some did retain their original ones, like Larry Juris as producer, and as mentioned earlier, James Cathcart working on adapting the English scripts, but others took on new ones. Probably the most notable one was Armin Moslemian. He had previously served as the sound supervisor final mixer, and was one of the ADR engineers from Princess vs. Princess to Your Star, Laritar, and was now not only back as audio engineer mixer, but he was also the new voice director for the series. What's so fascinating about Moslemian becoming the voice director is that he had no experience doing voice directing in other projects. Like with the cast, I'm sure Moslemian was a fine person and did the best job he could. But it was apparent he was very hit or miss with his directing, particularly early on in the season where it seemed like he had the actors only do 1 or 2 takes of each line, though he did get better by the time Diamond and Pearl rolled around. Interestingly though, the show wasn't the only thing the cast was working on. Around that same time, in addition to doing the 9th movie, Pokemon Ranger and the Temple of the Sea, they were also doing voice work for the educational website, the Pokemon Learning League. Click here to learn more about that, which had started development in January of 2006, not long after Pokemon USA acquired the licensing from 4Kids. What's notable about the website is that while recording of the anime was done at Taj, recording of the Learning League was done at Duart Video and Film, who of course would later take over production of the dub, though Taj did record some of the early lessons. Also, given that the website was in production prior to the premiere of the Mastermind of Mirage Pokémon, this of course meant some of the early lessons made were recorded with Casey Rogers voicing Ash. As a result, for the lessons that were already completed, like the Lunar Cycle and Fractions, they were released pretty much intact. That was except for one small change. They later had Sarah Natochenny go in and record a couple of new lines, though it was only the bits where Ash was addressing the mission guides by name. If you paid close attention, you can tell when the voice briefly changes from Casey Rogers to Sarah Natochenny and vice versa.
That's true! And some nights you can't see the moon at all.
I wonder if there is a way to know for sure if the moon will be out.
Sierra at the Learning League lab would know. Let's give her a call on the Pokepilot. Hey Sierra, can you help us out? Let's see if we can get some help on this. Ada at the Learning League lab is really good at solving problems. She'll be able to help us out.
It is rather weird that this happened, but it's also pretty fascinating. Now, this is just a bit of speculation, but it's likely that working on the Learning League helped the cast get a better grasp on their characters, as it allowed them to loosen up their performances and thus weren't nearly as rough sounding as they had been at the beginning of Battle Frontier. Anyways, getting back onto the show, when it came to the one-off or minor characters, their performances were very hit or miss. Some of them were perfectly fine and suitable, while others were really stilted and wooden, to the point where it sounded like all of their lines were done in one take, which wouldn't be surprising to learn if that's what actually happened. Once again, to be completely fair, the actors that got to voice some of them probably didn't have a lot of time to prepare or familiarize themselves, and just performed with the directions they were given. As for some of the Pokemon voices, they would use archive recordings from older episodes to fill in the roles, like for Maze Squirtle and for Voltorb, just to name a couple. Overall, the cast did a relatively decent job with taking over as the characters. Yes, they were rough and stilted sounding at the start, but they gradually warmed up to them and some were able to get into their roles easier than others. But this was only the beginning for them, as they would progressively get better as the series went on for the next few seasons. Now, for those of you that remember watching Battle Frontier as it was premiering on Cartoon Network, you may recall catching a few glaring errors in some of the early episodes. For example, in A Chip Off the Old Block, the Pokédex referred to Marshtomp as the Mud Pokémon, and a little later, Max says that Mud Shot is an Earth-type attack. Or in Wheel of Frontier, Ash mispronounces Medicham as Medicam. Of course, errors like that were not unusual or uncommon for the dub. I mean, need I point to probably the most egregious example of this?
Trainers, which one of these Pokemon evolves into Seviper? If you chose Arbok, you were right.
However, the main difference with those errors versus these ones is that the crew later went back and redubbed those lines in order to correct them. And ever since, every subsequent rerun and home media release would use those updated versions. While it was admirable the team made that move, the one catch to it was that it made it obvious which lines were redone, as the new recordings didn't exactly match up with how the voices sounded through the rest of the episodes. They could have easily fixed that by just re-recording all the lines in full as they did with the first example, but hindsight is 2020. Also, starting with this season, the English openings would be shortened from 1 minute to 30 seconds, as most intros to Cartoon Network shows at the time were that long, though with a few exceptions, and to accommodate for more commercial space. With all that said, for Pokémon USA, even with all those changes, all that really mattered was how well the show was performing. And on that note, despite the initial fan reception, Battle Frontier had overall performed decently well. Sure, its ratings weren't quite like they were during Pokemania, but it did well enough for the show to continue on, which it would with the next series, Diamond and Pearl, which first premiered on April 20th, 2007 as part of a special preview, as well as to coincide with the American release of the Diamond and Pearl games, then was later played in the correct order on June 4th. So, with the new season and cast of characters, How did the cast fare this time around? Well, by this point in the show's run, much of the cast had begun to get more comfortable with voicing their characters. Yes, some of the voices still sounded a little rough, but now they were much more familiar with them and were allowed to be much more flexible. As a result, their performances weren't nearly as stilted as they had been during Battle Frontier and began to sound more natural, like how Ash's voice was noticeably much less gravelly. Now, when it comes to the new cast members that were hired on, given that they were voicing newer characters, they weren't nearly as restrained in how they were directed to do the voices and thus had more room to settle in. Of course, their performances weren't entirely perfect, as they would sometimes sound a bit stilted and had some occasional slip-ups, but that got ironed out as the season progressed. Probably the standout ones of the bunch were Emily Jennings as Dawn, and Julian Rebelito, apologies if I mispronounced that, as Paul. Jennings was able to bring the right energy and quirky enthusiasm to Dawn, which makes sense as her character was just beginning her journey, as well as occasionally being a little witty and snarky, while Rebelito got the stoic and no-nonsense serious tone for Paul.
Piplup, this is so exciting! Professor Oak is in town to do his TV show. I so want to do something to show him how much I admire him and his poetry.
I'm going to go back to Snow Point City and request another battle there with Brandon.
As for the others, Bill Rogers had started to come into his own by the end of Battle Frontier, and at this point, he was much more settled in as Brock. As for Serenado Chenny, now that she had gotten a better grasp on her character and was given more leeway, she began to iron out a vocal take that best suited her natural voice, which did result in her Ash voice sounding slightly higher pitched during this time.
We were wondering, what's with all the boxes, Nurse Joy? The center isn't closing, is it? Piplup looks great, Dawn. And Zoe, you and Glammeow are in top form.
Pikachu!
But once she got a take that worked, that was when she truly began to come into her own as the character, and eventually made the role her own just as Veronica Taylor did. By late 2007, shortly before production on the season wrapped, another big change would soon take place. On January 2nd, 2008, Larry Juris announced that Taj was no longer going to be working on the show, and that beginning with the 10th movie, The Rise of Darkrai, Duart Video and Film would assume the production. The final episode Taj dubbed Smells Like Teen Spirit premiered on February 1st, 2008. And it also marked the final use of any background music that was originally produced by 4Kids. So what happened to Taj after that? Did they go on to produce more shows? Well, not exactly. It was rumored for a long time that Taj had shut down completely in early 2009. But in actuality, what happened was that Taj got disbanded and was reformed as Taj Mania Entertainment. Today, they still create and produce original music for many projects along with making original animated productions. However, they haven't dubbed any more anime since then. Well, gotta admit, that was an unexpected trajectory that they took.